I was meant to be an engineer, but I didn't spend much time studying engineering. I spent all my time taking photographs instead. I mean, I was keen on photography when I went up to Cambridge. It was like the last of a series of childhood crazes that we used to have in those days, like Meccano, toy trains, and things like that. I think that before the days of iPods and iPhones and television, kids used to do far more practical things, and television and photography was a practical thing. You'd go in the darkroom and make images, and it kind of stuck. I didn't finish at Cambridge. I was actually thrown out
Oh.
6 weeks before my finals. And I went up to London and went to see the Daily Express because I'd been doing pictures for them in Cambridge a bit. And I asked for a job, and they kind of laughed at me. And but it was chaos in the office. You'd never get anybody's attention for more than a few minutes. The telephone would ring, and something else would happen, and they'd call conference. But after I'd been back there 3 days, they said, "Oh well, actually we're a bit short next week. Will you help us out for a couple of days?" And I stayed there 2 years. The first big assignment during the first week was a story about a gang of East End youths who joined the Territorial Army so they could go and, be licensed to beat people up. And so it was them going out as a gang, more or less, on patrol with the Territorials. And it made a photo news, which is like a half-page spread they had in the paper. But the only thing, the gang didn't like our story very much, and came into the office to try and beat me up. Fortunately, I wasn't there. Everybody in Fleet Street in those days used to use Rolleiflexes. That was the standard camera, a Rolleiflex with a flash gun on the side. And I'd been sort of under the influence more of things like Life magazine, and was entirely a 35mm person. So although they did give me a Rolleiflex, one got stolen and one got run over by the Queen Mother's car. And so I ended up without one, and I shot everything on 35mm. And I found it was an advantage, because if you went to something like a society wedding with a wide angle lens, you could just dive in the middle of things and you could get pictures that other people couldn't get. So I felt the days of Rolleiflexes were over, really. The competition to get into Fleet Street, to get onto a national newspaper, was still very great, and I think that I was unusual in that I think I was probably the only amateur who'd ever made it to a full-time job in Fleet Street without working for provincial newspapers first. But when maybe I'm jumping the gun a bit, but when the Sunday Times magazine started and they were looking for photographers to work in colour, there was just nobody around, because the magazine photographers that existed in the country had worked for Picture Post, which had gone broke a few years before, but none of them had ever worked in colour. And to my way of thinking, they went out and shot black and white pictures with colour film in their camera. They didn't think in colour. In terms of how you look at things, the whole process of photography, I believe, is in a way a process of abstraction. You're trying to reduce a very cluttered world to something that you can form into shapes and images that are simple enough to give you some strong impression. Now, if you're going to cover a news story and somebody with a red t-shirt is standing in the background, that can give you real problems in spoiling your picture. In black and white it doesn't really matter, but in colour that red t-shirt will ruin your otherwise beautifully composed picture. And what I did, I think, that nobody else did, was to go out and take colour pictures in fog and rain and things like that, because colour photography was considered something that you did on sunny days. It wasn't considered something you'd do, in the north of England or in rain or fog. This was taken in West Hartlepool. It was at a time they used to gather sea coal off the beach. There was very high. It had I think Hartlepool had the highest unemployment in the country, which is why it was a place of interest. And there were seams of coal out to sea, and every morning at low tide, You'd see them scraping coal off the beach and loading them into sacks and carrying them on their bicycles or on pony carts and so on. And this is an old man just on the seafront trying to get warm by throwing his arms around himself. During the 60s, I did go to a huge number of places. I think for the Sunday Times, and during that decade, I went to about 100 countries,
Wow.
which is quite a lot. For example, the Sunday Times commissioned me to do a story called The White Tribes of Africa with a writer, Richard West. And we went to, I think, 14 countries in Africa within 7 or 8 weeks. And they commissioned me to do a couple of 2 whole issues on a struggle for power in South America, and we went to 90% of the countries in South America within a couple of months. So there was a huge amount of travel. I did really go all over the place. I mean, I went around the world 3 times in 1 year. In terms of things like 35mm, digital and so on, they're all just tools. I mean, to me what matters is how you see something and what you grab. I think that if you don't make that composition at the moment you press the button, the chances of finding a good composition in the darkroom later are pretty small. But as far as the digital thing is concerned, I think that to me it really doesn't make any difference. There are advantages, there are disadvantages. Obviously it's nice to be able to see what you've got sooner. But if you imagine Cartier-Bresson using a digital camera, he always says that the moment of the ultimate moment for him is that moment of pressing the button. He wasn't really interested in what happened later. And I can't somehow imagine Cartier-Bresson going away into a corner with his digital camera and looking at all these images to decide where to go next. And it wouldn't have made any difference. And I think that it's not a big deal really. It's just one process rather than another. It's quite useful to be able to see what you've got. It saves you chasing around, trying things again and again. But apart from that, it's only a tool, and the picture is only as good as the way you saw it at the time. I think the last film I shot was about 3 years ago, and I think because I was shooting in really exotic places, I'm getting a bit old for that. It needs, it takes a lot of walking and a lot of climbing. And so I decided to try and archive all my old still photographs. So I've been doing that for the last couple of years.
What do you think about being back in Hereford? I mean,
I love
was it something you always wanted to do, was to come back to Hereford? You've had this house since 1965 as well.
Yes,
so.
well, I used to come down here at weekends, but I was spending a lot of time travelling. I've always liked the countryside more than cities, really, so that if I don't need to be in a city, I don't. And I've got time. We have a horse farm here, and it's time to do things with horses as well.